Adjutorium nostrum in nomine Domini. All right, we pick up, continuing with history. We're looking at Saint Benedict, chapter 2, the Holy Abbot Benedict. So, I only have one source of this book. There is the other copy there. So we're going to the youth of St. Benedict when he was a little boy going to school. This is where we left off. The discipline in such a school was severe and inelastic. There were few holidays and many floggings. And even if St. Benedict was fortunate enough to sit at the feet of a grammaticus, that is a grammarian, who had some higher motive than profit or self-exploitation, St. Benedict had little interest in learning for its own sake. He was one of those rare spiritual men, like St. Anthony, who seemed to see truth directly without having to grope towards it through intermediate processes or ratiocination or reasoning. Loving God and viewing all things in the light of eternity, he was shocked and disgusted beyond measure by the prevalent immorality which he must have encountered among fellow students and even among his teachers. And if he thought to escape the corruption by taking a religious habit, the monasteries of Rome offered him little inducement. Through lack of the right sort of organization and discipline, the institution established there by St. Athanasius had begun to lose its first charity. It may be that in an age when even the splendor of St. Vincent of Lerins had faded, young St. Benedict discovered in some of the once holy houses of the 4th century some of those unpraiseworthy monks whom he was to describe so vividly years later at the beginning of the Rule, where after praising the Cenobites, he calls the Cenobites the strong race. Cenobites are under an abbot, and they obey him, and they storm heaven this way. They fight Christ's battles this way, like an army with a commander and his soldiers. That's who he compares the Cenobites to. So they have the Cenobites. These are the strong race of good monks. And then he talks about the Girovags. The Girovags. And who else does he mention? A despicable sort of monk. He has another name. Cenobites, Girovags, and I don't remember the other one. There's a third group, basically, who follow no rule, and they just wear a habit, but they're a scandal everywhere they go. Praising the Cenobites, who lived in monasteries under an abbot, and the Anchorites, who fought the devil single-handedly in the desert. St. Benedict, here it is. They're called vagabonds. Vagabonds. Girovags and vagabonds are the despicable sort of monks, says St. Benedict, who they don't obey anybody. They just go wandering, getting drunk when they want, praying when they want. No rule of life, often a scandal. Here, this is quoting from the Rule of St. Benedict right now. The third kind of monks, a most detestable class, is that of the Cerebites. Oh, I forgot them too, the Cerebites. So we got these wild monks called Girovags, vagabonds, and Cerebites. Sounds like some insects, doesn't it?
What does he call them? The most despicable?
Yeah, a most detestable class is that of the Cerebites, who not having been tried by rule or by experience, as gold is tried in the furnace, but being softened like lead by their works, showing loyalty rather to the world, publicly by means of the tonsure profess their infidelity to God. So they wear the tonsure, the habit, but they are loyal to the spirit of the world. These in twos or threes, or even alone without a master, shut up in the sheepfolds of their own choosing, not in those of the Lord, have as their law the gratification of their desires, since whatsoever they consider agreeable to their own will and fancy, this they call holy, and unlawful whatever is not their choice. The fourth sort of monk, called vagabonds, spend all their life wandering about through different provinces, dwelling 3 or 4 days now in one monastery, then in another, always roaming about with no fixed abode, given up to their own pleasures and to the excesses of gluttony, and in all things more vicious even than the Cerebites. Of the most wretched manner of life of all these, it is better to be silent than to speak. So it's better just not even to mention them. So this is actually quoting directly from the rule. The monasteries of Rome as a whole may not have been nearly so bad as these two types, yet it seems probable that they had shared in the general deterioration of the Roman clergy at the end of the 5th century. Since the beginning of the Acacian Schism in 484, there had been two parties in the church at Rome, those who insisted on the uncompromising observance of the Orthodox faith, in other words, traditional Catholics, without any prejudice to the authority of the Holy See, and the more noisy, liberal, or compromising Catholics, who always took the course of least resistance, the course most pleasing to the world, the course calculated to win favors from the emperor and the patriarch of Constantinople. So you have the Catholic traditionalists and you have the Catholic liberals. When Pope Anastasius II died in the year 498, the Orthodox, and in this sense is not schismatic Orthodox, here the Orthodox means traditional. The Orthodox, or real Catholics, elected the deacon Symmachus to succeed Pope St. Athanasius II, while the liberals set up the antipope Laurentius, thus beginning the Laurentian Schism, which lasted until the election of Hormisdas, Pope Hormisdas, in 514. As always in such cases, Catholics were confused and did not know where to look for guidance. Church discipline suffered, and immorality and heresy followed as a matter of course. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? So, if Father Waugh actually holds a council and elects a pope, maybe himself, it won't be the first time you have anti-popes. Right? Look at, in the year 400s already, they're choosing anti-popes. Now, St. Benedict was a student in Rome at the beginning of the Laurentian Schism. So he lived through that scandal of this liberal group electing their own pope. The scandal may have brought him to his decision to cut loose from an evil and divided city and to find peace, as St. Anthony had so many thousands had found it among the wild beasts that had never insulted their Maker, and under the clean stars that did his will perfectly. That's well put, isn't it? Animals who never offend God, and the stars of the heavens that do his will perfectly. At an uncertain date, which most students place between 495 and 500, so between 495 and 500 AD, St. Benedict quietly left the city of Rome and made his way with his faithful old nurse Cyrilla, or followed by her, to a little town called Enfide, now called Affile. Hey? Today, the name of the city today is Affile. Affile. Some 35 miles from Rome, where he lived for some time with some certain good Christians near the church of St. Peter. Then St. Benedict struck north alone and made his way through the deep gorge of the Anio until he found, where it broadened out to the lower end, two artificial lakes. Today we call them reservoirs. Two artificial lakes supported by masonry dams, one above the other and surrounded by wild and utter desolation. The Emperor Nero had built on the shore of one of them some baths and a sumptuous villa, where he spent a great deal of his time and probably indulged in some of his debauches. Nothing was left but some heaps of marble ruins. The rain and the sun and the clear waters of more than 400 years had washed away the last smudges left on that lovely valley by a bloated carcass stained with unnatural lusts, a soul spotted with Christian blood. So Nero killed many Catholics. Now there were no discordant sounds to vie with the singing of birds and the murmur of the Anio, A-N-I-O, splashing from lake to lake and fall to fall. Here at last, St. Benedict felt at home. Anybody know the name of this place? Subiaco, which in Latin means sub laco, under the lake. So at the near the base of the lake, Subiaco. One day, St. Benedict encountered the crags of a wild man with a sheepskin around his loins. He was a hermit named Romanus, Saint Romanus, who first tried to send him back to the city, but finally, on seeing the sincerity of his purpose, gave him a malota or sheepskin garment such as his, that the Eastern solitaries wore, and showed him a cave hidden in the side of a mountain. There for several years the young man dwelt alone, spending long hours in prayer and trusting God for the food which he found growing in the wilds, or now and then dangling on a rope's end outside the cave. For the good Saint Romanus would suddenly appear on a cliff far above and lower a loaf of bread together with a little bell, whose tinkling summoned St. Benedict from his meditations. Otherwise, the older man never troubled him. So once in a while, he'll send down food to St. Benedict. Yes, St. Benedict, like all the saints, had his own peculiar and extraordinary temptations. The devil that fluttered around him in the guise of a black bird, till he banished it with the sign of the cross. The tantalizing image of a beautiful woman he had seen in Rome, who became sensually visible before him, luring him to imaginary delights that almost blotted out the memory of Christ from his tortured mind, until, near to despair, he flung himself naked into a thicket of brambles, rolling about until he was scratched and bleeding from head to foot, but firm master of his flesh, his thoughts, and his emotions forever after. So yes, there's other commentaries say that this woman that he met in Rome, she was not some prostitute. She was not some loose girl. She was actually a very noble girl. She would have been a very fine wife, many children, virtuous, dutiful, humble, charitable, vivacious, etc. That's who the devil would try to lure him away with. A good woman, not a prostitute type of woman, but just a good, virtuous woman. That's who the devil was using to try to deter St. Benedict from going higher. That's an important point, because a lot of people think, well, it was just a loose woman that was always tempting him. No, it was a good woman the devil was using. A very virtuous woman, who would have made, in our language, a very good traditional Catholic mother. "700 years later, in the year 1223, the gentle St. Francis of Assisi, who had rolled in a snowbank and well understood what St. Benedict had endured, prostrated himself weeping before the bramble thicket, and planted beside it 2 rose trees, which long survived it. 'The violent take it by storm,' said the Lord Jesus. The violent take heaven by storm." So St. Benedict went to Subiaco. St. Francis of Assisi went to Subiaco 700 years later, 1223. And there's a painting of St. Francis on the wall in Subiaco while he was alive. Isn't that interesting? So while St. Francis was alive, the monks of St. Benedict painted his figure and face on the wall. And it's still there today. And St. Francis planted 2 rose bushes, which are still, there's roses still blooming there. I don't know if they're the ones he planted, but they're still blooming there. That's Subiaco. St. Benedict shunned the faces of men. Yet, like St. Anthony and all the other contemplatives, he found in prayer a form of action that drew them as if he were a magnet. Some shepherds, seeking their vagrant sheep, thought at first that he was a wild animal. Finally, they met St. Benedict and talked with him. He saw that they had virtually forgotten their Christian faith and practices and had reverted to a brutish paganism. So St. Benedict spoke to them, these shepherds, of Christ and of his church, and of many spiritual things for which they had hungered unawares. In gratitude, they began bringing him food. Soon he was known all through the district as a holy man whose prayers brought good fortune. So St. Benedict, trying to hide from the world finds him. Finally, some monks came from the abbey of Vicovaro, 18 miles away, to ask him to live with them and govern them in place of their abbot, who had just died. Vicovaro, 18 miles away from Subiaco. So these monks heard about him, and they come to St. Benedict. "Please, can you come and be our abbot? Be our superior?" And St. Benedict says, "Well, if I come, you're not going to be able to go out partying on Friday night. When I come, you're not going to be able to just sleep in every day. You're not going to live like the Girovags, vagabonds, and Cerabites. I will impose on you a rule of life based on the Gospels." Yes, come. Well, we'll see what happens. St. Benedict had grave misgivings about these monks, but after some hesitation he went and found himself at the head of a bizarre establishment of solitaries rather than cenobites, living in a series of caves honeycombing a vast cliff. Their refectory, a large cavern, their chapel, a grotto. Taking his office very seriously, the young abbot, St. Benedict, attempted to replace the disorder he found among them by the discipline of rule. Their drastic need of such reform is suggested by the violent anger with which they reacted. In fact, they tried to poison St. Benedict at table and would have done so if the lethal cup had not broken, as if struck by a stone, when he made the sign of the cross over it. St. Benedict arose, looked at the broken fragments and the spilled wine, and said, Brethren, may Almighty God have mercy on you. Why would you treat me thus? Did I not tell you before that my ways and yours would never agree? With that he departed and went back to his cave in Subiaco. So they tried to poison him. And he left. The experience taught him how much the men of the world needed the wisdom he had learned in solitary prayer. From then on, St. Benedict would accept disciples who wanted to live near him and imitate him. Thus, St. Benedict the Hermit became Benedict the Cenobite. But, seeing that the corruption of Vicovaro had been caused, in part by the large number of monks, he decided to limit his community to 12. When more came, he would organize a second group, then a third. In the course of time, there were 12 of these, living in as many rude wooden houses, which they themselves built under his instructions. So there was 12 groups of 12 monks. So St. Teresa of Avila, she says the Carmelite nuns should not exceed 13 or 15. So they saw it more fruitful to have smaller groups. It's more like a family. And it runs more smoothly. And I've lived in both situations. And when there's many, like 70 seminarians, it becomes like an institution. It becomes a little more... I don't know how to explain it. It becomes just more institutional, less of a family and more of an institution, and people can get away with a little more. By this time, the fame of St. Benedict's sanctity had spread as far as Rome. A patrician named Tertullus. A patrician is one of the... Tertullus. He's one of the, high-ranking men of Rome. Tertullus brought his son, Placid, to be raised and instructed in the monastery. Another, named Equitius, entered his young son, Marus. So Tertullus would bring his son, St. Placidus, and the father Equitius would bring his son, who?
Marus.
St. Marus. So let me see. Placidus, I think, was 7 years old. Marus was about that age also. So they were just little boys. So you'll find in the rule of St. Benedict rules about how to handle the boys in the monastery. They can eat meat because they're still growing until they're 21. He says also, let the boys undergo the discipline of the rule when they misbehave. But St. Benedict, being very wise and very balanced, he said if any of the monks misuse the boys or overly beat them when they don't deserve it, let that monk undergo the discipline of the rule. So it's very wise, you see. The boys need discipline. They need to be watched. They need to be encouraged and taught. But if one of the monks teaching them or over them abuses them by overbeating and being unfair, let him undergo the discipline of the rule himself. So it's very well balanced. And these are barbarians, A lot of the early monks were barbarians. Guys who had been through battle. They probably had scars, some of them maybe lacking an eye, an ear from battle wounds. Tough guys. And the proof of it is one of the one of the early instruments of good works that's listed in the rule is thou shalt not kill. So that tells you barbarians in the monastery with monks, they might have gotten in a few fights, and some of them might have pulled out a knife and threatened the other. Because there's also a little rule in the Holy Rule of St. Benedict that says, don't sleep with your knives. Don't sleep with your knives. So obviously they could carry knives, and you always use a knife to cut fruit, to get wax off, to screw on a bolt. So knives are always useful. It's like the handy Leatherman. But don't sleep with your knife on your side, says St. Benedict. So I wonder why he says that. Possibly an obvious reason is you might turn over and stab yourself. But, maybe a barbarian monk dreaming of his battles might start swinging his knife and drive it through the brother sleeping on the cot next to him. Who knows? And when the monks slept, they were also sleeping in one big room with a light burning. That's how they slept. It was a big dormitory. So that must have been hilarious at times. All the snoring, sleep talking, sleepwalking, monks snoring like chainsaws. You get all that in the dorm. Okay. So these two boys, St. Maurus and Placidus, learned the lesson of prayer and self-denial so well that today, after many centuries, the whole church still venerates them as St. Placid and St. Maurus. St. Placid's feast day is what, anybody? October 5th. And St. Maurus, when's his feast day? I think it's in January. Yeah, we just had it not long ago. Many and beautiful are the traditions of their adventures with St. Benedict in the following of Christ. St. Maurus, after founding the famous monastery of Glanfuel in France, died as a hermit in the year 584. With all his monks as a glorious martyr. So let's take a look at this. So he dies in 584. He joins St. Benedict around, let's say, the year 500. So he's 84 years old. He was in his 80s when he was martyred, probably. St. Maurus, yeah. While St. Placid, having established a monastery in Sicily, ended with all his monks as a glorious martyr. So St. Maurus died as a hermit in 584. St. Placid died martyred with all his monks on the island of Sicily by a bunch of pirates. St. Benedict was finally driven from Subiaco, according to St. Gregory, by an evil priest, whose name was Father Florentius, who resented the unfavorable light cast on his own miserable life by the purity and harmony that reigned among the monks as they worked, prayed, and sang on the heights. After an unsuccessful attempt to poison St. Benedict with the gift of a loaf of bread, which not even the saint's pet raven would eat. So it was believed that when St. Benedict received this loaf of bread, the raven came and took it. And instead of going up in the heights and eating it, he didn't touch it because it was poisoned. So the raven, that's why St. Benedict is often pictured with sometimes a chalice with a snake in it, like St. John, or a raven with a morsel of bread in his mouth, because they tried to kill him. Father Florentius aimed a still more deadly blow by paying some harlots to walk naked among the young monks as they worked in the garden of the monastery. So what a corrupt priest, isn't he? St. Benedict, returning suddenly, saw with grief the destruction of much of his work and resolved to stay there no longer. St. Benedict was 50 years old when he took a chosen number of his monks, presumably those who had not yielded to the sudden temptation thrust upon them, in bidding farewell to the cave that had been his residence for 30 years, made his way south through the wild hills of Abruzzi in Italy, until he came to the huge mass of rock and greenery known as, anybody?
Mount.
Where will this famous monastery be built? In Abruzzi.
Sorry.
Monte Cassino. Monte Cassino. At its foot lay the ruined and impoverished little town of Cassinum, in the old Latin way between Rome and Naples. Above this, the mountain sides were densely clad with woods, and far above, on the crest, St. Benedict learned were sacred groves and marble altars, where the peasants still offered sacrifices to Jupiter, Apollo, and Venus, nearly 5 centuries after St. Peter and Paul had brought the gospel of Christ to Italy and died for it. So there were still pagan practices going on, worshipping of the Roman gods. And this is in the 500s. So, what happened? When St. Benedict decided to leave Subiaco, one of the younger monks heard news that Father Florentius was killed. He was on his 3 or 4 story porch, and the whole thing collapsed, and Father Florentius was killed. So one of the young monks came running up to St. Benedict and said, I have good news, Father. Father Benedict, I have good news that Father Florentius is dead. He's dead. And St. Benedict corrected him and said, you shouldn't be rejoicing. You don't treat our enemies that way. You pray for him. Don't rejoice in their misfortune. But it is true, Father Florentius died not well. He didn't die well. So, did he save his soul? Question mark. St. Gregory's account makes it appear as if St. Benedict went at once to the mountaintop, as holy St. Patrick had gone to Slevan Yarain to overthrow the stone image of Apollo and cut down the sacred grove that shrouded the usual obscenities born of idolatry. More probably, he began living in the woods as a hermit, as at Subiaco, until he and his monks, having built houses for themselves and won the respect of the Pagani, the pagans, in due course persuaded them to destroy the idols in the grove and to worship the one true God on the cleansed mountaintop. This seems more consistent. There is a tradition in the footnote here. There is a tradition that the mountain was given to St. Benedict by the rich Roman Tertullus. So Tertullus owned that property, the father of St. Placid, and he gave it to him, which is also possible. This seems more consistent with the gentle, patient character of St. Benedict. At all events, it was not long before he was ruling over a complex community of monks, or series of communities on the lofty crest of the mountain. So, let's see. How high is Monte Cassino? What's the height? It's not a huge mountain. The height of Monte Cassino. Monte Cassino, the historic rocky hill in Italy, has an elevation of approximately 520 meters, which is 706 to 1,710 feet above sea level. So 1,700 feet above sea level. That's a good hill. That's higher than Rattlesnake Mountain here, isn't it? What was Rattlesnake?
Here.
1,700. So it's a good hill.
I think it's 1,200 maybe.
Okay, so it's higher than Rattlesnake Mountain. So it'd be closer to this, maybe the size of some of the mountains just up the road here. At the foot of the mountain lay a ruined and impoverished little town of Cassinum, of the old Latin way between Rome and Naples. Above this, the mountainsides were densely clad. St. Gregory's account makes it appear. Okay, we saw that. This seems more consistent. At all events, it was not long before he was ruling over a complex community of monks. Where the temple of Apollo had stood, he raised an oratory in honor of St. Martin of Tours. And on the site of the vanished altar, he set up a chapel to St. John the Baptist. His own dwelling was in the upper part of an ancient stone tower, apparently part of the citadel wall of the dilapidated town. As years passed, larger and more substantial buildings arose in the monastery. St. Benedict had to build as he could with the materials at hand. The devil, of course, did all in his power to interfere with the work. Stones became immovable till St. Benedict prayed over them. Half-constructed walls fell down, and on one occasion killed a boy monk, whom, however, the saint restored to life. So that happened. That's in the dialogues written by St. Gregory, that there was a big wall. The wall was pushed over by the devil, and it's a sturdy wall. They didn't build cheap and unintelligently, these monks. The wall was obviously pushed over and killed and crushed one of the young boy monks. So they unburied him under all the stone, and they took his body all mangled and bleeding, and they brought it to St. Benedict. And St. Benedict prayed over him, made the sign of the cross, and all his wounds and broken bones came together, and he was brought back to perfect health and perfect life. And yeah, I told you already once about the big fat devil. St. Benedict said, "Can't you see why you can't move it? There's a big devil sitting on the rock." And they could see a big fat ugly devil sitting on the rock. So St. Benedict drove the devil away, and they were able to continue building. As St. Gregory has left us no details concerning the buildings, we must infer that they were, in a general way, from St. Benedict's own rule. For obvious reasons, the monastery was well enclosed and had only one gate. He says, "Let there be placed at the gate of the monastery a wise brother of mature age, who is able to understand and reply in all matters, and whose grave habits will not permit him to wander about. This porter is to have his cell near the gate, So this is the porter monk who's at the gatekeeper at the entrance. Okay, we'll continue. What's good about this rendition of St. Benedict's life is he's quoting a lot from the Holy Rule of St. Benedict himself. Adjutorium nostrum in nomine Domini.